It is a land of mystical powers and ancient ruins, a land of great good and great evil, a land of elves and men, dwarves and orcs, hobbits and dragons. For the better part of a century, people across the world have been enthralled by the land known as Middle-earth. Today, in the first of a two-part video, we'll take a surface-level look at this famed fantasy world and attempt to provide some insight for those who have yet to dive into the beloved works in which it lives. This first part is focused on describing some key aspects of Middle-earth and its history until the beginning of the Second Age. I believe this can be a great primer for the new Amazon Prime show The Rings of Power, but can also be very useful for a new reader of Tolkien's work. Middle-earth was developed by the author J.R.R. Tolkien. While many fantasy worlds endeavor to be separate from our own, Tolkien envisioned his creation to actually be our world, during a long-forgotten history in the ancient past. In fact, western Middle-earth greatly resembles Europe, with a frigid north, temperate middle, and an arid south. Snow-capped peaks of the misty mountains and the arid Lewin call to mind the Alps, but the fresh farmlands of the Shire are reminiscent of England. There are even dense forests like those found throughout Europe, but many have been reduced by the Third Age of Middle-earth. Now, in speaking of Middle-earth, most people intend to refer to the whole of Tolkien's created world, but in fact, Middle-earth is a particular continent in the realm that Tolkien calls Arda. For these videos, I'll be referring to Arda, as well as other places like Valinor or Numenor, so the term Middle-earth will be used just to refer to that particular continent. Even what we call Middle-earth is really a smaller part of the continent of Middle-earth within Arda. It initially looked less like the Third Age map of Middle-earth than most people are familiar with. In truth, a large area once existed to the west called Beleriand, which greatly extended the continent of Middle-earth and even connected it to the Undying Lands to the Helcaraxe. Beleriand would not last, but pieces of it can still be seen on the Third Age map of Middle-earth. Tolkien himself was a professor of philology and had a great love of language. In truth, Middle-earth and the stories involving it were developed to give his languages histories, cultures, and beings who spoke them. We will explore Tolkien's constructed languages in a future video, but know that his languages were prevalent throughout his works and greatly influenced Middle-earth. Tolkien even created a fictional source for his stories called the Red Book of Westmarch, which, as the story goes, he translated to bring us the famous stories of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. These stories take place in the Third Age of Middle-earth. This video focuses on everything up until the end of the First Age, for which our main source is the Silmarillion. As well, during this rundown, I'll mention what are essentially the great powers of Tolkien's legendarium. Eru Iluvatar is the great deity. The Valar are the powers of the world. The Maiar are somewhat lesser deities, and Melkor, who is later called Morgoth, is the first big bad of Arda before Sauron takes center stage. In the beginning, there was only Eru Iluvatar. He willed into creation the Ainur, who sang a great song. With this song, Iluvatar created Ea, the universe. Within Ea, the Valar, the greatest of the Ainur, attempted to bring about their vision of Arda, creating lands, mountains, and valleys, only for Melkor, one of the Ainur, to bring them to ruin. In time, the lands were eventually formed, and it was in this time the landmass of Middle-earth was made whole. The years of the lamps began with the Valar forging great lamps to light the world. One such lamp was placed to the north of Middle-earth, and another far to the south. As well, it is in this age that Melkor came back to Middle-earth and built a fortress in the far north called Autumno. From his bastion, Melkor struck down the lamps and brought about destruction and fire through all of Arda. After this, the Valar relocated to Valinor, in the land of Aman, to the west of Middle-earth. After the destruction of the lamps, the Valar brought forth two great trees, Telperion and Laurelin, which brought light to Valinor. Middle-earth, however, sat in twilight with only stars to illuminate the lands. Early in this time, Melkor created the fortress of Angband, which was headed by Sauron. As well, Melkor raised up the Misty Mountains to hinder the travels of the Valar in Middle-earth. All the Valar awaited the awakening of the Elves, the firstborn of Iluvatar. To give them light, Varda, the queen of the Valar, used the dews of the tree Telperion to wrought new bright stars. Upon completion of this labor, the first children of Iluvatar awoke, and elves entered Middle-earth, off into the east. The First Age begins with the awakening of the elves in Middle-earth. This event heralded great change as the Valar, once they learned of the awakening, strove to defeat Melkor and keep the Eldar, as the Valar named the elves, from his shadow. The northwest of Middle-earth took the brunt of the damage from this war initially. The sea between Aman and Middle-earth, the Bellabergolts, was deepened and grew wide. Many bays and gulfs along the coast of Middle-earth were formed. The fortress of Autumno was broken, but not fully destroyed, and Melkor was captured. With Melkor likely being aware of the Eldar awakening before the Valar, some elves were seized by him before his defeat, and transformed into the race of orcs. With Melkor captured, the Valar summoned the elves to Valinor to reside among them. Many did make the journey to Valinor, with the three main groups being the Noldor, led by Finwë, the Teleri, led initially by Elwë and later by Olwë, and the Vanyar, led by Ingwë. Some elves stopped along the way or actually fled the summons of the Valar. The ones that remained founded dwellings in the far western part of Middle-earth, which was called Beleriand. These settlements included havens along the coast, such as Brithambar and Eglarest by the Teleri elves. Eventually, the dwarves also awoke in Middle-earth and founded cities like Khazad-dûm and Belagost. The dwarves and elves met one another and partnered together to create many great works, among the most notable of these being the halls of megatruh. The next great catalyst of change in Middle-earth came about due to events that transpired not within its own borders, but within Valinor. The Noldor learned from the Valar and crafted many great works, but none were greater than the Silmarils, crafted by Fëanor, the son of Finwë. These three jewels were beyond compare and contained the mingled light of the two trees. Melkor, after many years of imprisonment, was granted pardon, unchained, and eventually fled Valinor after further attempts at treachery were revealed. Afterwards, he found the creature Ungoliant and struck a bargain with her to exact his revenge. Under a darkness, Ungoliant and Melkor returned to Valinor and destroyed the two trees. Before fleeing, Melkor slew Finwë and stole the Silmarils. Thus ended the years of the trees. Many fell events followed this calamity, such as the Oath of Fëanor, the first kinslaying of the elves, and the sundering of the Noldor. But it ultimately brought about the return of the Noldor and Melkor, who had now been named Morgoth, to Middle-earth. As the larger host of the Noldor reached Middle-earth, the Valar set the moon in the sky, and it traversed 7 times before the sun followed. This begins the years of the sun, which covers the rest of Middle-earth's history, but to simplify things, we will continue to use the ages of the children of Iluvatar. The Valar, at this time, also worked to hide Valinor, so it cannot be so easily reached. Enchantments were set about the sea around Valinor, and it became unreachable to all save the Ainur. Now, once the first sun rose over Middle-earth, the second children of Iluvatar, Man, awoke also in the eastern part of the continent. Man would slowly make its way into Middle-earth's history, but they did not come into Beleriand until 300 years after their awakening. While somewhat allied with Morgoth, great houses of man would be established and would play an important part in the history of Middle-earth. Many battles would be fought in the First Age between the elves, dwarves, men, orcs, and balrogs, the Maiar which Morgoth had twisted to his service. And the casualties would be numerous. Feanor was, within days of reaching Middle-earth, slain by balrogs. Many of the descendants of Finwë would meet similar fates, one even falling to Morgoth himself. While the elves would win some battles, true victory was never really close at hand. Over time, the Noldor would establish great cities such as Gondolin and Nargothrond throughout Beleriand, with the many princes of the Noldor dividing up the lands, save where the Sindar elves already dwelled. Many of these cities were destroyed, and the introduction of wingless dragons by Morgoth spurred the destruction. Victories by Morgoth during the Battle of Sudden Flames, the Dagor Bragollach, and the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, the Nirnaeth Anoediad, greatly decimated the elves in Beleriand, and largely drove them to the coasts of Middle-earth. The last holdout of the Noldor was the secret city of Gondolin, which fell to betrayal and dragonfire. The Silmarils are what drove much of the conflict and strife of this age, as the Noldor constantly battled to retrieve them from Morgoth. Morgoth possessed all three for many long years, eventually having one stolen from his crown by Beren, a man, and Luthien, an elf. It was this great deed that began the mingling of elves and men, eventually leading to the marriage of Eärendil and Elwing, who would have two sons, Elros and Elrond. The Silmaril stolen by Beren and Luthien would end up with Elwing, their granddaughter. Eärendil was a great mariner and, eventually joined by Elwing, they would use the jewel to reach Valinor. Eärendil begged the Valar to forgive the Noldor for their transgressions and to come to their aid before Morgoth's final victory in Middle-earth. Thus began the War of Wrath, where the Valar and the elves of Valinor traveled to Middle-earth to combat Morgoth. The War of Wrath ended with the defeat of Morgoth. His forces were decimated and few of his Balrogs survived. The fighting and powers were so great that most of Beleriand was sunk into the sea, forming the western coast of Middle-earth as it would be in all future ages. Morgoth was bound and, with no chance of pardon, cast into the void. The elves were summoned back to Valinor, and many did return, but some refused. Notably, elves like Elrond, Galadriel, Celeborn, Círdan, and Gil-galad remained in Middle-earth, and were leaders among the Eldar in new kingdoms. The other son of Eärendil and Elwing, Elros, chose to be counted among men and became one of the Dunedain, men with great power, wisdom, and longer lifespans than that of other men. He would become the first king of Númenor in the next age, and thus began the second age of the children of Iluvatar. I want to say thank you for watching the first video this channel has put out. The next video will be covering the second and third ages in Tolkien's literature. I hope this served as a great primer for future viewing or reading in Middle-earth, either of which are strongly encouraged. As well, I want to say thanks to all the artists whose artwork was used to make this video. I've tried to credit all I can, but if your artwork is used and not credited, please let me know and I'll be sure to credit and link to your work. If you see artwork that you enjoyed, I would greatly suggest purchasing prints where possible to support the artist. Namarie.